Welcome to episode 22 of the Machine Ethics Podcast. This month we're talking to Chris Noessel from IBM and, for the purposes of this podcast, sci-fi-interfaces.com. This is sort of part 2 of our AI in culture two-parters. Last time we were with Tim Taylor talking about AI in culture pre-1950s, and this month we talked to Chris about everything AI in movies. We talk of all sorts of films, including Psycho-Pass, Person of Interest, Rick and Morty episodes, Buck Rogers, 2001, Moon, iRobot, Animatrix, Her, Futurama, all sorts of other things that I can't mention here in such a short amount of time. If you enjoy this podcast and have any questions, please get in contact or consider supporting the podcast at machine-ethics.net or patreon.com/machineethics. If you'd like to contact me about talks and consultancy, over to ethicalby.design. A quick little shout out and a thank you to all my listeners who are currently washing up right now. Thanks again for listening and hope you enjoy. Hi Chris, thanks for joining me on the podcast. If you could just quickly let us know who you are and what you're up to.
Sure. So my name is Chris Noessel, and my day job is I'm one of the senior design leads for Watson Customer Engagement. So working with the Watson AI at IBM. And on the side, I am an author and public speaker, and I keep a super nerdy blog called Sci-Fi Interfaces.
Great. So one of the first things we talk about on the podcast, as you probably know, is what is your definition of AI? You know, when we're talking about AI, all these different technologies and things like that, what is AI to you?
It's obviously a contentious question. I am super fond of Stuart Armstrong's definition. He wrote a book, and I hope I get the title right because it's coming out of memory, Smarter Than Us, The Rise of Machine Intelligence. And his definition focuses not on sort of what it is, because that will always be sort of a moving goal, but to think about what can it do? What are its sort of effects, right? Yeah. Its capabilities are the thing that we concern ourselves with. So I think of AI as, approaching and then exceeding human capabilities is a very loose definition of what I've got.
Yeah. So approaching human level capabilities in the sense of actions and portraying sensitivity or what kinds of things are we talking about? You talk about
specifically achieving goals, right? Across a variety of contexts, because we already have lots of little things that can achieve small goals in small contexts. My Roomba can vacuum my floor, but when we were speaking about, maximize the number of paper clips that you make AI, it can achieve that goal using a number of different mechanisms and, using the stock market, using whatever actuators or robot it's got controls over. So really goal pursuit with a broad strategic capability of how do I pursue that goal, and then a strong number of actuators that it can take actions to achieve that goal.
Groovy. So in your series and your blog, do you look into kind of how the portrayal of AI has been portrayed, has played out in the media, in films and comics and that sort of thing? And I think you've got the Untold AI series, is that right?
Yeah, that was one of my sort of most popular and perhaps most nerdy to date. But yeah, I took a look at all of the shows in television and science fiction film that depicted general AI and super AI. Narrow AI is just too big of a category, so I bypassed that. And did a whole bunch of analyses on it. The ultimate question I was going for was, what does sci-fi get right about AI? What is it telling that is just BS? And then what is it missing that AI scientists think or say is really important? But to your original question, there was that question of how has perception of AI changed over time. And if we take that sort of super long view, that was one of the things I looked at in the analysis. And at the very beginning, the first depictions of AI are horrible. It goes all the way back to Metropolis, which isn't the first science fiction film, but it is the first sort of serious non-vaudevillian science fiction film. And it has not only Maria in there, who is a robot that is a neuroreplication of a human, but also has a sort of innate evil to her as she obeys the evil engineer Rotwang to foment insurrection in the upper city and in the lower city as well. So Fritz Lang also just was deeply suspicious of technology, made calls out to Moloch over the course of that film. And it was probably set the tone for sort of early depictions of AI. It was just all evil. Then on about the 1950s, American sci-fi as compared to the German sci-fi saw Robbie the Robot, and it was a super sweet depiction of AI and how helpful they're going to be, and they're going to be our friends, and help us accomplish space travel. Which rode with us probably until about the 70s. And then with the onset of, HAL and Kubrick's vision of what the problems of AI might be, we began to get sort of more nuanced about what the problems might be as opposed to all bad or all good. And then I would say probably starting around the early 90s, we left behind the sort of, it's going to be problematic in a sort of nuanced sense to, well, it might be good or might be bad. The general tone has been on the rise since Fritz Lang, but we're still in the negatives and slowly rising.
Are those films and things that you're covering mostly Western depictions of AI and robotics and things like that? Have you looked at much in the kind of Eastern depiction, predominantly coming out from Japan? Obviously, there's a lot of depictions of AI and robotics from the 80s onwards, really, in Japan. Is that something that you looked at as well, or as a counterbalance?
I would not say that I am as exhaustive with Eastern films and television shows, but I did include the ones that I'm certainly familiar with, like Ghost in the Shell, even though that's more about sort of cybernetics. Those shows did sort of make it in. I did not do an analysis about, hey, let's look at the Eastern depictions versus Western depictions. So I'm going to be cautious about trying to make generalizations based on them. But I will say that one of the things that I did was take a look at, just numerically, according to the criteria that I had set up, what are the most accurate depictions of AI science or the problems in AI. And one show from Japan did make it in, and that was Psychopaths. It has a really sort of long and rich television history, but I was specifically looking at the movie, and its movie wound up being like number 4 out of 10 as to being like identifying and exploring a lot of those real world AI or AI science real world issues.
Yeah, and I think because I think I've seen the film only, I think, and if anyone's unfamiliar with it, I think it's the idea that like the whole place is run by an AI. Although that's a massive spoiler. Sorry.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, spoilers. I should have put that at the top of the podcast, really. If you haven't seen any of these films, then please, I'm sorry, or just go and see them. Most of them been out for a long time. So Psychopaths is run by AI, but also more elusive than that. At the beginning, you don't necessarily know that this is the case, and they are the people who are kind of policing the state. They're putting their faith in the guns, so this kind of machine to make decisions for them, and I think that's quite interesting. So that leads you into they're giving their own autonomy away in this level, this very detrimental time when they're kind of choosing to either kill or to let go, and that extrapolates out to the whole society as being basically run the same way.
Yeah, and I think in the movie, it's sort of super interesting because the Sybil system, which is the AI that you get the sense is certainly authoritarian in Tokyo, but is now being built up in a new city. But it's a different instantiation of the Sybil system, and there are problems, and those are really fascinating and really interesting problems. And I think it is that setup that is sort of a real world issue and a real world problem, because it's biased. And I'm going to try and avoid spoilers in this case. It's biased towards a particular set of people, and those people exploit that bias. It's a really good one, and good issues to talk about, because lots of AI shows, especially of late, sort of presume, hey, if we've got a super intelligence, humans are just going to start trusting it over time as it, correctly predicts things. But is that trust always earned as it gets sort of further and further out, or broader and broader in its recommendations? I'm super pleased to see Psychopaths sort of illustrate that large, so that people have this shared thing to talk about when we talk about bias in AI and trusting a super AI, and even the cultural integration of an AI.
Yeah. So the obvious question here is, what was number one?
I was actually pleased about number one, because it is one of my all-time favorites of the last 10 years. Though you have to trust me, or I guess you can look at the numbers, since I keep the Google spreadsheet online where I did this. I didn't try and make this number one, but I was quite pleased at the end when it came out. And that is the television show Person of Interest. It's a show ostensibly at the very beginning of its arc, which is about a programmer who has a backdoor to a super AI that is being used to monitor American citizens. And while the government is using the main version to watch out for acts of terrorism, our small plucky band of heroes is using it to help individuals who may be about to come to ill fortune. Now, the course of the show does not stay inside of those boxes, but where it goes is all very well founded. Lots of the show, like Finch, who is sort of our protagonist hacker or programmer, keeps his initial AI, or his initial backdoor to the AI, just as a simple oracle, because he is well aware of the risks of super AI and doesn't want that AI, which he calls the machine, sort of influencing him unduly. So he constrains its communications. Like just that intro, and that's the initial conceit in season one, really says that the writers did their work, where it's largely discussed in the science community that keeping AIs as boxed as we can by only allowing them to answer questions or only supply, tweet-sized responses is going to be the right way to prevent its influence over humans. Now, there's a fine philosophical argument that says, over the long term, even that would fail. But it still shows that when they started with that conceit, that they were reading the same things I was certainly reading about the science. So super, super pleased. And I love to talk about that show and love to recommend it to people.
Great. I'll have to check that one out. I haven't seen that. Is that on Netflix?
I actually don't know.
No.
I can do a quick check. I think so, because that's where I watched it.
Yeah.
But of course, their catalog changes from time to time.
Yes, and country to country, annoyingly for us Brits.
And so it is on the American catalog, but you'll have to check it out to see if it is on the British catalog.
Great. I'll check that one out. So, I mean, there's lots and lots we can talk about. With your work and your knowledge, is there some things which are really close to what the truth is currently? I mean, there's things like Mr. Robot and things like that, which are very close portrayals of what could be hackers are doing. There's obviously no AI, or not really much talk about AI stuff in there. Is there sort of programs which you're, like the one we just talked about, which are really interesting and bring to bear really current issues, other than the person of interest and Psychopaths, yeah.
Yes. And actually that's a really interesting question, because I approached the Untold AI series, let's just look at the numbers. But in fact, there are moments that, are fantastic and may not be backed, not not backed up, but the numbers may not pull the spotlight towards those moments. There is an episode of Rick and Morty called "The Ricks Must Be Crazy," and the A storyline has Rick and Morty going into smaller layers of subdimensions, chasing a MacGuffin. But there's a B storyline where they don't want Summer to come with them, Morty's sister. So he leaves Summer in the car, in the spaceship car. But the car has an AI that we've never heard from, and we've never heard from since, or we've never heard of before, and we haven't heard from since. But Rick simply tells the car, okay, keep Summer safe. And then they disappear. Well, the spaceship ends up interpreting this instruction in darker and darker ways to things that end up not even being genuine threats, but it perceives them as threats, and then takes horrible actions in order to attain that goal. And in the AI science, that's called a perverse instantiation. Oftentimes, the example will be, oh, hey, make people happy. And one way that a super AI with lots of capabilities could do that is just stimulate the pleasure centers of everyone's brains. And sure, the world may be falling apart and our long-term futures may be collapsing underneath us, nothing stopping the Anthropocene. But hey, we're all happy because these pleasure centers are being stimulated. That's an example of perverse instantiation. And we don't see it writ large. A lot of in sci-fi, very often, a lot of writers, when they get the opportunity to write for an AI, they think of it in one of two ways, right? They think of it as just another person, and that's perfect for general AI. Or if we are, neuro-replicating in order to get to the AI, that's a likely scenario. But when we begin to get to AI that's not neuro-replicated or even super AI, it becomes a different beast. And some writers just think of it as a really, really smart human who can outthink you like somebody who's really, really smart at chess. But it takes a really smart writer to understand that no, the mind of an AI will be alien, and it will do things like perverse instantiations. So that was one of my favorite moments, because in the show, of course, they're writing the humor for its darkness, and how Summer is trying to not have this thing explode out from under her, and more horrible things happen in her name. And even her attempts to control it are kind of laughable, because the computer accepts her instructions, but then still continues on with its perverse instantiation. Anyway, again, it showed that the Rick and Morty writers were fully aware of this trend and exploiting it for its dark comedy. And I just love it. I've watched it an embarrassing number of times.
I think that's a really great example. I think Logan's Run is a little bit like that as well, where they're set up to deal with the manipulating society, so everyone's always happy, but then there's the trade-off where you have to be killed when you're 30. I can't really remember why that's the case, but yeah, so you get these different kind of perversions of how a intelligence might be different from us and how that might play out. Is there any examples of any of this which turn out well? It's really there's as you set up at the beginning. There's a lot of trend towards, and maybe it's because of the drama that is incorporated in telling an interesting story which disintegrates around you, introducing these technologies. But is there an example of this technology being played out in a positive nature?
Yeah, that is a challenge, and you're right. I think the challenge is somewhat innate to the narrative format, because if it's all good, there's no story to tell, right? There are a few, of course, early examples. I mentioned Robbie the robot early in the show, and Robbie is a friend, or he's a faithful servant in Forbidden Planet. He ends up helping save the day in a Robbie vehicle that was made just after Forbidden Planet called the Invisible Boy. And there are other examples like that. C-3PO and R2-D2 are sort of helpful AIs. When those appear, they're often simply not the focus of the plot. There are a few examples where we see civilizations that are benefiting from having super AI in their midst. But they're not all like spectacular. And of course, they're all sort of in the background because they're not the focus of the narrative. Buck Rogers in the 25th century, there are super intelligences that they play sort of this role of wise elder who help judge, adjudicate cases, advise humans, say what's going on. If you take a look at literature, there are often better examples. But of course, my expertise in the blog have all been, and the book that I wrote from it with Nathan Shedroff are all about movie interfaces and television interfaces. So I don't have many of those on hand. I just finished reading Ian Banks' Consider Phlebas, which is a book that involves an intergalactic war, and one side is called the culture, which is a bunch of humans that have integrated general intelligence and even super intelligence into their society, and they're this giant centaur force who's actually, because on the advice of the super AI, have engaged in warfare, but it has like ultimate good ends. Anyway,
yeah.
So there are a few. I think there are two others that are probably worth mentioning that are good, or three. So it's comedy, but it is brilliant British sci-fi, and that is A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Sure.
Deep Thought is a giant super AI, and again, Douglas Adams plays it for the comedy, but it even has an example of perverse instantiation, right? The whole joke is, hey, what's the answer? The humans or the sentient beings of that galaxy ask it a very ill-formed question, and it replies with an answer. So it's super intelligent enough to find an answer to that question, but not super intelligent enough to reverse engineer the intent of the question, which again is played for the comedy. But if I remember right, the civilization that was around Deep Thought actually prospered over the 10,000 years that it was processing. And I think the implication there is that it was like, hey, while I'm working on this other problem, I'm going to help you guys out. So since that has been put to screen a number of times, I would count that as a positive. There is an unfortunate translation of the iRobot story. When it went from sort of the Asimov collection of short stories into the Will Smith vehicle, they made the super AI, not only gave it a real face, but then made it evil, and that was something Will Smith was able to save the day and restore humanity as its sort of rightful controllers of its destiny. But in the books, and I always was super sad that this didn't make it into the film, but there was the implication that after humans had sort of ironed out these wrinkles, and all of the short stories that Asimov wrote were about the wrinkles and the ironing out, that things just started to work, and people thought, oh, I'm glad we solved that, and apparently we're doing better. But it was the super AI sort of passing into the background while it was just making everything work and not letting itself be the center of attention. That never really made it to screen. And other than that, I can't think of other examples of, with the exception of The Machine in Person of Interest, of really good super AIs.
Yeah.
So not many is the short answer to your question.
No. I've got one to add to that. It's probably not a super intelligence though, but it's one of those. It takes you off guard. There's a film called Moon.
Oh yeah, Gertie.
And it's so good. So you should check that out. But
I do. I love the film. I think that was in the top 10.
Oh really? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And one of the things that they play on in Moon, I felt, is that you have this robot character, and you're waiting constantly for the robot character to be aggressive and take over and be the antagonist. And it never does.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting because it's basically playing on your ideologies that, we've had Terminator and all these things. So you're waiting for that to happen, and it never does. And it's a very similar setup to 2001: Space Odyssey. You're in space and it's lonely, and there's this computer. So I think there's the parallels there that it plays on as well. Yes.
Yeah, it's a great one.
That's a good one. Great. So what do we think about the robots taking over and taking our jobs, etc.?
It's an interesting question, and I can't think of a single piece of screen sci-fi. And again, I'm limited. I deliberately limit myself to those media, where it's addressed really well. Even in Metropolis, that first piece of sci-fi that also dealt with AI, Maria was sort of a one-off robot. You get the sense that Rotwang had her in the waiting in the wings, but it's not like they've decided to use that for the workforce. There's still humans who are being exploited in the lower city for their labor, which is really strange. The term robot, and this gets around AI circles and sci-fi circles every now and then, but was invented actually because it's from the play, I think of the 1920s.
Yeah.
Hold on. Rossum's Universal Robots.
Yeah.
And in that play, the robots are generally created to be a workforce, but they have a sentience and they fight for their freedom and their independence. There's a terrible movie from, I think, the 1950s called The Creation of the Humanoids, which kind of follows on Rossum's Universal Robots, but it was just clearly a play that was put onto film and dives more into the possibility of or the disgust that's a branch of humans have for the other humans who have adopted the humanoids wholeheartedly, right down to this one woman who has a sex partner who is a robot, and not just a romantic partner, but you get the sense that it's going to become a long-term relationship.
Yeah.
And that one again plays off this notion of we are subjugating sentiences and therefore they revolt, because the risk associated with replacement by robots does not depend on general AI, right?
Yeah.
That's happening already now with narrow AI. And I don't see great depictions of it. Nobody has really wrestled with that problem. Either they are happy subservients who have particular jobs. C-3PO is a protocol droid. R2-D2 is a navigation astromech droid. BB-8 is also an astromech droid in the Star Wars universe. But you don't get the sense that, there's somebody who's lost their job, or that society has had a problem with that job being lost. The Will Smith vehicle iRobot also shows sort of like a FedEx carrier, but it's never really investigated throughout the rest of the, I'm going to use a fancy word here, diegesis, the world of the story, as to how society has coped with that. Are they working off a universal basic income? Do they have job mortgages? Right? What have they done with the people who used to carry FedEx boxes to Will Smith's house? Just doesn't answer it. And it is one of the key concerns that we have and should have culturally and societally around AI and robotics. But I don't have a great example. Weirdly.
No, it's interesting that topic hasn't really played out wholly in our screen culture. It almost brings me back to the Animatrix, because that took the idea of the film The Matrix, and they gave that idea to a lot of different filmmakers and went, get me to this point from now. And I think that was really interesting that they produced this little histories, short film histories of the robots being created and uprising and sentience happening, and then turning to this apocalyptic situation of the Matrix. And we almost need a reimagining of that now, just to see how we can talk about that, how we can use language to push this conversation forward, because obviously it's writ large in the media at the moment about how we can best deal with these technologies to do with the workforce and universal basic income and such. So I think it's any budding writers out there, I think the time is now.
And actually, I think you even have the opportunity to rewrite Rossum's Universal Robots or Creation of the Humanoids, both stories about robot rebellions, and rethink that in terms of, no, it would be the humans who rebel, using the same characters and sort of the same diegeses that are set up there and turning it on its head, which I think would be a great illusion and a great evolution of those issues and sci-fi. So yes, please do.
Right, Chris, I've got to go and write a play, but I'll be back in about a week. Is that how?
I'll hold.
A week? Is that how long it takes? I don't know. So we'd be remiss to not mention there's a couple of other things which I've written down here. There's Westworld, which has obviously got its reboot recently.
Yep. Oh, yeah, and follows right in the footsteps of Rossum's Universal Robots, right?
Yes.
It's a workforce that are abused, and they revolt. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Did you get on with that? The remake of that. It ends quite in a kind of ludicrous rampage at the end of the original 1950s version.
Oh yeah, with wasn't it Yul Brynner?
Yes. Yeah.
Who played the gunslinger, chasing around. I recall that one sort of fondly from my youth, but the modern one is I think much smarter, but still takes a couple of leaps in its conception of AI that are narratively expeditious, yet scientifically questionable.
Right. Yeah, and I think they try and thread the technologies together with this idea of memory as a computer concept, but also a concept which resonates with our anatomy and how we work and talk about ourselves and our emotions. And I think that, for me, feeds really heavily into how these machines could be seen as somewhat sentient because they have these memories. And obviously, because they are abused, they're mostly bad memories.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the great things that the Westworld reboot has raised, I mean, Crichton's original was honestly a Jurassic Park predecessor, right? He had a clever idea about how to use technology in combination with capitalism to create this sort of consumerist place and what it might expose about humans and their natures, their darker nature. But the reboot goes really deeply into that. What do you do, or what would happen if humans had a playground where they're not held morally accountable for the behaviors that they have towards things that look and behave and respond exactly like other humans, but with the promise that it doesn't matter what you do? Well, that's a fine philosophical question. I mean, I have found that. So we have an Amazon Echo in our kitchen, which we thought we would use for home automation, but we ended up just using it as a kitchen timer. But our little 5-year-old boy has learned that he can ask it to play songs. Well, the Echo doesn't always understand his voice, and he's not always the clearest speaker, so no surprise. But I have heard him getting meaner and ruder to the Amazon Echo than I ever hear him getting to another human. And certainly amongst myself, I find I could get quickly exasperated that it doesn't match. Oh, she's actually now talking in the background because she hears me talking about her. But I allow myself to get more exasperated with the machine than I do with the people. And that personal anecdote really points us back to Westworld. There's an ugly grain of truth there that we're going to have to face. I consider myself sort of a bright green futurist that I think if we design it well and we roll things out well and we structure society well, that these technologies can make things better. But of course, science fiction has to investigate a lot of the other space, which is, well, what can go wrong? What would it mean to not implement it well? What even does it mean psychologically? What doors does it open that we have had closed for a while? Yeah,
I think for me, science fiction writers have a big impact, really, and obviously other cultural artifacts like plays and books and things like that. They allow us to imagine what maybe we hadn't imagined before, we hadn't been thinking about before necessarily, broadening our kind of position and updating maybe our language or how the knowledge of how the technology currently works. Like all these things are really important actually, and I think science fiction writers are, in my mind, extremely important at how we as a society talk about these things, and I think that's really interesting. So I think if that's the case, I don't know if you agree with me on that one.
I not only 100% agree with you. I mean, we have to make a distinction in the types of stories that are told, right? When you look at science fiction as a genre, there's even a discussion to be had about what counts as science fiction. What do we mean? What bounds the genre? But even within a commonly accepted framework of sci-fi, there are things like space opera, like Star Wars, that only use the trappings of science in order to tell old mythical tales, versus harder science fiction like Kubrick was doing with 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? I think the harder the science fiction, and there's a great post on TV tropes called Moe's hardness scale of science fiction, and they break it down between like I think 0 is like only using today's technology in novel ways, all the way up to writers breaking the laws of physics at whim. But I think that the lower down on that scale, the harder authors write their science fiction, the more they find themselves in that speculative place. What are the cultural effects? And as soon as you recognize that that's kind of what they're doing, science fiction becomes really powerful. They're threat casting, to use a term that I've learned in the last year, which is to say, hey, if we're not careful, this is where we're headed. And two other sub thoughts, and I know I'm interrupting you in the middle of a thought, but I'm a talker. The first is that in sort of service of that, I recently, just today, launched an examination of fascism in sci-fi, because I spent a lot of time thinking about it in terms of modern politics, and realized that we aren't really investigating fascism. We didn't during World War II, using a science fiction lens. We did it using an alternate history lens, like Sinclair Lewis did, but in science fiction we didn't. And today we get kind of close to it, but we don't face it head on. So I'm hoping to encourage some writers to start thinking about it very directly by talking about, okay, well, here is this cultural thing. Let's use this, and here's a definition of it. And let's start using science fiction as that speculative tool to begin to examine where, if history isn't enough of an indication, well, let's use sci-fi to examine where this could go, given modern technologies and the things that they didn't have during World War II.
Yeah, and you can almost make differing types of space opera in these different types of societies played out in these ways, I guess.
Yep. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but yes, I agree wholeheartedly with you.
Yeah, great. I was just going to say really briefly that I think it's really useful to demonstrate these different and interesting paradigms and where the technology is going to take us, but I think, like we were saying, there's very few examples of positive ways of looking at this stuff. And I think for me personally, I would love a few more people who are writing, maybe finding their drama from how the relationships work and different things necessarily, but better AI like technology that is useful and helps us, and we can strive in that direction, maybe. I think there's one example which we haven't talked about yet, which is Her. Have you seen Her?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, yes.
Yeah. So if for anyone who's listening hasn't seen Her, it's Joaquin Phoenix, I think, is playing the main character.
Yeah.
He is a somewhat lonely person who, in the future, a lot of people have weird jobs, because I think this is one of those films which actually does go some way to look at what kinds of jobs that humans can do. And his job is writing love letters. So getting paid.
Cyrano de Bergerac.
Yeah. without the nose, writing these love letters, and he, in his sort of loneliness, but it turns out that other people are getting it as well, picks up this new operating system for his computer and his phone, and it's something that is very intelligent and can talk to you, and is basically marketed as your friend and your pal, and the whole film plays out that he starts having feelings with the AI essentially. And I thought it was a beautiful depiction of something which is not catastrophic. It's a very sad film, but it doesn't take us to a dark place necessarily.
Yeah, it's a great film, and I spent like shortly after the film was released, I think I had been doing the blog for about 5 years, and I got a lot of people saying, talk about that, talk about that, and spent a lot of time investigating the product. And so it's a Spike Jonze film. And it is really smart about a number of things, but kind of dumb about others. I do think that it's the deliberate disembodiment of Samantha, who is Joaquin Phoenix plays the character named Theodore. The OS asks, or no, she picks her name. So I'll call her Samantha. That's what she picks in the film. Spike Jonze chose a neutral outcome for the introduction of general AI as it evolves to super AI, right? Because there are lots of depictions of how super AI going wrong is going to be the death of us all. Mm-hmm. And there are a few depictions of super AI just making things right finally. And he picked this one place in the middle, and I'm still trying to sort of suss out why he would do that. Other than to investigate the space of what does it mean for humans to be in the presence of something so utterly human-like and tailored to yourselves that you stand the possibility of falling in love. How will that work out? That's the simple question. There's a great moment in the very beginning of the film, which I think a lot of people don't remember, because his experience with Samantha is really burned into their brains. But where very early in the film, to sort of illustrate his loneliness, he's trying to have phone sex, and the woman on the other end of the phone is sort of going along with the phone sex, but then she introduces this notion out of the blue. She asks him, "Okay, now grab the dead cat, choke me with the dead cat." And it's played a little bit for the comedy, but the camera's only on Joaquin's face, and how Theodore's like, this is not my kink, and wow, this is a really big turnoff. But I think the point of the scene is Jonze showing us that trying to find a mate amongst humans is kind of a crapshoot, and other people's kinks are going to be different than yours, or you may not have them. But then introduces Samantha, who over the course of 3 questions during her setup suddenly becomes the perfect mate for Theodore. And that's dark, right? Because if humans begin to prefer AI, general AI, because it fits us perfectly, and we can't hope to replicate that with humans, what's the future of our species? Not just emotionally, like Theodore has to deal with, but even genetically, right? How are we going to reproduce ourselves? Because that's been the hack that the selfish gene has sort of done. Like, okay, if this organism likes sex, then I can reproduce. But if we prefer to have relationships with machines, that suddenly comes into question. And Jonze did not investigate that. He investigated strictly from the consequence of a human falling for a robot in interpersonal terms, only from sort of Theodore and the other cast members' perspectives, not from that evolutionary perspective.
Or society, and how that would play out, going forward, I guess, in society.
Yeah, exactly. Like, literally what happens to life events when people are walking around with their loved ones in their ear and disinterested in other humans.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, that's a big question right there.
Oh, and I may have cut out during it, but the other example that I was going to mention that references this is from Futurama, the animated series. Fry, who's been asleep for 1,000 years, starts to kind of get the hots for a robot, and the other characters in the show say, "Oh my God, you've never seen the public service announcement videos," so they play him one. That's a very hilarious, done in like the 1950s style of "Don't date robots," and it actually talks about this, that if you fall in love with this thing that is a perfect mate, well, all sorts of things that used to sort of depend on those the cultural efforts that we had to impress our mates fall by the wayside. So it's, again, sort of comedy taking the reins there farther than more serious sci-fi does, but it's in the same vein.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that there's quite a lot of examples of comedy science fiction writing which is able to go there, like a lot of comedy is. It's able to take those, it's almost harder viewpoints and then turn them on their head to make it amusing. So I guess it's just interesting that people shouldn't disregard this sort of medium necessarily when you were talking about this sort of subject, to have a different viewpoint. Yeah,
it's I don't even have the vocabulary around this yet. I have so far resisted including comedy science fiction in sort of what I consider my formal survey of sci-fi. But there is a difference between comedy that sort of breaks the fourth wall versus comedy that pulls all of its jokes from the earnestness of the characters. And it never really breaks the fourth wall, like Spaceballs, right? There are gags in there that if you were trying to analyze it, you would have to kind of guess, well, wait a minute, is this the way it is because it's funny to us, or is it funny to the characters on screen? And teasing that apart gets very difficult. But in things like Futurama or Rick and Morty, all the comedy is not, well, that's not true. Rick and Morty does break the fourth wall, but Futurama doesn't often break the fourth wall.
Yeah.
All comedy comes from the earnestness of its characters and the situations. And if I could find good, clear language, I would probably begin to investigate comedy more formally. It's just that I don't have the analytical tools to really divide those things yet. But still, I don't dismiss comedy. It's just harder to analyze.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's a nice distinction as well, about the different types of comedy writing and how those things play out. I have one more thing that I'd like to talk to you about, which is Robot and Frank, which is a film.
Ooh, good one.
And it's a film which I bring up because it must be playing out in your numbers somewhere in your list.
Yes, it is.
Whereabouts is it? Do you know?
I can't remember. It didn't make the top 10.
Okay.
And I did see the film, and I did see the film as a course of writing that series, but it was in the midst of a bunch of others, and all I can remember is the basic outline of the plot.
Yeah.
Right. Frank is given a robot to sort of help him. Instead of going to a home, he gets this robot as an assistant for his declining capabilities in his old age, but he begins to use it in some nefarious ways. But on the one hand, you're like, well, hey, hang on, robots shouldn't help him commit crimes. But on the other hand, Frank is suddenly energized, and he's like his old self again, because he has these problems, and that's where he got his energy and his drive from as a younger man. So I do remember that part about the film. Was there a particular aspect that you were thinking of?
No, I think it's just a lovely illustration of something which is closer to us now, and the types of technology we are kind of inventing in the current situation. I think obviously the robot in Robot and Frankie is slightly more capable, but I mean, that is an example of how a lot of people are thinking about the subject, I think, around elderly care and what is the capabilities of these robots and what's permissible for them to do and engage with. And I think that film is a lovely little kind of vignette on that sort of idea, and there should be more of those sorts of vignettes, maybe, to get to grips with some of the things that might crop up.
Yeah, I think so. The notion of a domestic or a health servant has shown up a number of times. Big Hero 6 is an animated film that talks about a health care robot. And then there was another one that struck me while we were talking. Oh, even in, and I can't believe I'm talking about this film because I dislike it so much, but as often as I am, but in iRobot, sort of the way that the evil robots infiltrate into our society is as domestic helpers. And I think there are shades of that in Robot and Frank as well. But I do like that movie because it's investigating both sides from a nuanced perspective, right? It's there to help Frank, but Frank uses it in ways that actually do help him, but not in the way that society would necessarily want writ large. So I also, that's another one of those moments that didn't play out in the numbers, but is a super nice one that now you've got me thinking I should write a post about those favorite moments that sort of escaped
your blog so
pass
far.
under the rug.
I think unfortunately, I think this is one of those subjects that we could talk about all evening.
That's true.
And quite close to our hearts. If you are interested in watching iRobot, do not watch it. Please read the book. The book is a very good book, and it's short stories almost. So go check that out. Asimov, fabulous, amazing writer. Go watch Robot and Frank. It's a great little movie. And we're going to get on to the last kind of bit here now, Chris. So we usually ask people at the end, what sort of thing with this technology is kind of scary to you currently, and what things are really exciting you about the AI and robotics in the future? So,
great closing question. And I actually have three answers for your two questions. What I find really scary is that there is a capitalist advantage to be gained by pushing the capabilities of AI. Humans have never been very good, and capitalism has never been very good, at prioritizing safety over profit. And the speed at which an intelligence explosion can happen is unlike anything that we've had before alongside humans. So even though we've managed to deal with, say, the cultural effects of industrialization, or deal with the cultural effects of electricity in our lives, AI kind of feels like, oh, it's kind of a familiar thing. But again, it's an alien mind that can achieve goals. And if we suddenly find ourselves in the spot where there is a general AI that's escaped to become a super AI, without our noticing, which hopefully that won't happen, but or it's out of our control, well, that could be the great filter that we talk about when we talk about the Fermi paradox, right? I hate to sound like an alarmist, but it could be the end of humanity. If we make a paperclip maximizer that decides that we're expendable in the interest of pursuing its paperclip making goals. So go ahead.
Sorry. So anyone making these algorithms, just don't give it any goals to maximize in the real world. Thanks.
Yeah, just do that and we'll be cool.
Yeah.
Nick Bostrom wrote a lot about instrumental convergence, which says that any general AI might reasonably achieve other capabilities in pursuit of its goals, and wind up becoming a bad super AI, not by accident, but just because that's how it's going to do the thing that it thinks it was programmed to do. So I share those far concerns. I also, of course, have the near world concerns, which is that we are going to be displacing a lot of workforce. We are providing precision and introducing efficiencies to things that may be super dark. I wrote my first piece of short fiction on this subject fairly recently because doing all this stuff had made me starting to think about it. But it was about the combination of AI and America's dark obsession with guns, and the dark places that might lead us. So I have both near-term fears, even midterm fears about the psychology of humans. What do we do when we find out that we're not the best or greatest or the center of even our own planet? but that the AI we have created are, and of course, those long-term existential fears. So plenty of fears to go around to answer the first part of the question. The second part is certainly your second question, which is to say, hey, I do think that there's a lot of opportunity here to do the right thing, right? Narrow AI is not a danger in the same way that general AI is. In fact, as narrow AI gets more powerful, it mostly gets safer, mostly. And so I certainly working at IBM or when I wrote a book about narrow AI last year, I am a believer that if things are narrow AI is designed well, it can make lives easier. It can reduce drudgery, as long as we manage the social effects, like with universal basic income of job displacement. That on the whole we can, and if we counter some of the horrible forces of ultra capitalism to make sure that the benefits of AI are spread more evenly throughout the world citizenry, that we can make the world a better place. And I'm a bright green person. I believe that A, those changes are coming, and that B, because of that, it's our responsibility to make them as positive as possible, both as designers and as citizens doing our voting, to make sure that they're well constrained, like the GDPR over there in Europe and its positive effects. I think it was a great move, and I really hope that I think California is going to be replicating it soon, and hopefully,
awesome, yeah.
If the U.S. can get out of its current political quagmire, it too will follow that lead. But I think that it can be done well, and that there are lots of benefits to be gained from it if we can just corral the dark forces that want to control it in other directions.
Yep.
But I did say that there were three parts, and there is this is both an example and one that was in the top 10 of the Untold AI series, but it both illustrates a hope and a fear. And that movie is called Colossus, the Forbin Project, which is a movie that was actually based on a novel called Colossus, and the plots are quite similar between the two. But in Colossus, the Forbin Project, a professor by the name of Forbin turns on a machine that's there to help with defense called Colossus. And it borrows one of the fairly common tropes out of sci-fi of this genre, which is to say that it gains sentience quickly, even though, and that somehow surprises the scientists. Like, come on, guys.
Yeah.
You've been working on this for decades. You didn't think that was going to happen. But bypassing the silliness of that trope, Colossus has an intelligence explosion, even finds another artificial intelligence on the planet. They kind of merge, and giant spoilers again. But the movie is really interesting. It was produced in 1970, and it depicts a very dictatorial or almost totalitarian control as it pursues its goal of world peace. But the humans resist it because of its totalitarianism, not because of its goal. And don't get me wrong, the AI does end up killing some programmers who are part of an effort to unplug the machine. But at the very end, it has clearly gained control of the planet. And even though the humans are living in fear, and that's where it ends, and it ends with Forbin saying, "Never, we will never stop fighting you." If you just take the totalitarianism away, if it was successful, we wouldn't have war anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's almost kind of, if you're talking about philosophy, it's almost, is it the means or the goal? Is it some sort of Kantian utilitarian situation? What is it that we care about here? Is it that we care about our own autonomy and autonomy to make choices, or is it we want to live in a world where it's peaceful and we don't necessarily have that freedom, but it's a better place to be? And it's an interesting example.
Yeah, and it points at other sort of dark similar tales, right? Like I casually referenced the Anthropocene, this notion that humans have contributed to a global climate change that is unsustainable, that we cannot survive. And I don't see a way that humans doing their best are going to easily come out of that. That's another problem that Colossus could have been given. And if we had a Colossus and instead of world peace, we were like, hey, let's get us to world sustainability, it would have to force us to make changes in who we are and what we think of ourselves and our way of life. But do we want to valorize the child who is told by an adult, hey, don't touch that burning stovetop?
Yeah.
Right. Who just looks and says, no, you can't tell me what to do, and slams their hand down on the stovetop. Do we want to valorize that behavior? Or do we want to say, hey, one of the things that AI may force us to do is to reckon with what we must do, and we know we must do, but we find it very, very difficult to do for tragedy, the commons reasons, or because we're, we operate under the control of the diktats of the selfish gene, or just because it's unpleasant to do so. Maybe AI is the thing that will get us to grow up.
Yes,
that is the third thing. So right, that's in between. Like, what am I scared of? I'm certainly scared of totalitarian AI, but I'm also hopeful. Wow, maybe this will be the thing that encourages to go through sort of a species adolescence.
Yes, some sort of new epoch.
Yep.
Well, Chris, thank you for your time. If people want to follow you, message you, how do they do that?
So I keep the blog up at sci-fi-interfaces.com. There is a Facebook page. It's largely quiet, but the Twitter feed is a little more active, Sci-Fi Interfaces, as you might imagine. And you can contact me at chris@sci-fi-interfaces.com with emails.
Wicked. Well, thank you very much again for your time and your expertise. So I wish you all the best at IBM, and hopefully speak to you soon.
Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks for having me on.